Chapter 16, The Divorce. The death of Napoleon Charles had destroyed Napoleon's plans for the succession. The birth of Leon had made it evident that he might hope for a direct heir, and his passion for Madame Walewska had shaken his affection for Josephine. It is uncertain whether any overt discussion of a possible alliance with the Russian Grand Duchess took place at Tilsit, but immediately after the Emperor's return, the first steps were taken in the matter of the divorce. It was felt that a great advance had been made when the Emperor agreed to consider the idea, but a long interval seemed likely to elapse between its inception and execution. In matters where his mind alone was engaged, he suffered no delay when once his resolution had been formed, but proceeded to act directly upon it. In this case, his judgment indeed perceived all the evil consequences of Josephine's sterility and the advantages to be looked for from a divorce and a second marriage. But his heart cried out against his policy, hence the delays and hesitations of 2 full years, from July 1807 to October 1809, and those strange alternations of attitude, obviously due not to diplomacy but to love. Before Napoleon could steel himself to repudiate the woman to whom he was bound by a companionship of 10 years, by a passionate attachment, by his ardor of character, his vanity even, a woman he had loved sufficiently to let her share his throne, a woman whose relatives, to say nothing of herself, he had often preferred over his own flesh and blood. The tie between them was strained to breaking point, and divorce was not only prudent but necessary. He could not at first agree to sacrifice a companion whose merits grew in his sight in proportion to his own feeling of guilt towards her. She will not resist. She will die. He began to think that his own fortunes depended on her and on her star, but it was not an idle superstition that restrained him, nor even a dread of the judgment of his former companions in arms, of the army, and of the nation, should he repudiate the woman he had crowned with his own hand only 2 short years before. He gave little thought to public opinion, but he listened to his own heart and hesitated, weary of his vacillations. Some of his most trusted agents, such as Fouché, sought to precipitate matters by adroit insinuations which they hoped might induce Josephine herself to take the initiative of the impending sacrifice. Napoleon could not deny that this excess of zeal was born of projects he had formed and perhaps even discussed, but feeling himself vulnerable, he became violent. He repudiated Fouché's action with every mark of anger and contempt, treating him as he had never treated anyone, no matter of what condition in all of his life. What? Was he the man to yield to pressure from one of his ministers? And did this minister, this ex-policeman, dare to interfere in his domestic life and thrust his hideous face into the nuptial chamber? Josephine took advantage of his momentary rage and, acting on the sage advice of Talleyrand, who for some unknown reason was anxious to thwart Fouché, she went boldly to Napoleon. Lacking courage to declare herself, Napoleon hesitated, temporized, and finally allowed himself to be recaptured. For a time no more was heard of the lists of marriageable princesses compiled from almanacs, of the confidential reports of foreign agents, or of the various portraits brought together for comparison. Napoleon seemed more devoted to his wife than ever and was constantly in her apartments. Holding her in his arms, he wept over her and made vows of the most ardent affection. It was in vain that fresh arguments were brought to bear upon him, which seemed for the moment to convince him. The sight of his wife roused all his former feelings, and it was she who, pressing home her advantage, questioned him on the subject. Facing the idea of the divorce to all appearances more resolutely than himself, she told him openly that nothing would induce her to take the initiative. If he commanded, she would obey, but the order must come from him, and he had not the courage to give it. The consolidation of his power, the establishment of his dynasty, the continuity of his mighty work depended, as far as human wit could foresee, on the dismissal of a woman, and the man of iron could not nerve himself to the task. It may perhaps be asked whether the revival of Napoleon's love for Josephine induced a stricter fidelity than before. By no means. Fidelity was not an essential element in the feeling with which his wife now inspired him. His love was made up of memory, pity, gratitude, and tenderness. Desire was but a reminiscence. He had no illusions as to the youth and beauty of its object. When therefore Napoleon found younger and lovelier women within reach and took advantage of his opportunities, his affection for Josephine suffered no decrease. The sojourn at Paris and Fontainebleau from August to October 1807 witnessed the reign of Madame Guisini. Nor was Madame Guisini his sole distraction. The purely physical attraction she exercised over Napoleon by virtue merely of her extraordinary beauty was not sufficiently absorbing to occupy him for 2 months. At Fontainebleau, it was whispered that he was falling in love with Madame de B, lady-in-waiting to Princess Pauline. Madame de B, whose husband was distantly connected with the Beauharnais and who owed her appointment to this remote kinship, was one of the most lovely women of the court. Her rich and luxuriantly developed beauty, she was at this time just 28, was displayed to great advantage by her unusual height of 5 feet 6 inches. There were some who thought her head too small and her features too childish for her large frame, but these cannot have seen her as the queen in a game of chess at the Marescalli ball. She had a lively wit, no money and no prejudices. The emperor remarked her at one of the hunt breakfasts she habitually attended, admired her, and let her know it. He is said to have written to her. Her room was on the ground floor of the castle, overlooking the Garden of Diana, and easily accessible by the window to a nocturnal visitor, and raised step in the embrasure exposed the unwary to the risk of a noisy fall. But the lady was gracious and did her best to facilitate access. She reaped her reward, and her husband, a very old man, simple and credulous in the extreme, chuckled delightedly at the results. My wife, he remarked one day at a reception, is a woman of the most extraordinary resource. We are not rich, yet we seem to be. Thanks to her good management, she is a perfect treasure. Her exertions procured him the post of chamberlain to the last made king among the emperor's brothers, and the title of baron of the empire, in honor he owed to her own desire for that of baroness. The intrigue, the existence of which has been questioned by some, so well was the secret kept, was dropped after the return from Fontainebleau, and the husband's satisfaction in his domestic economy was somewhat overcast. He had other grievances. Madame de B quarreled with her princess about a certain brilliant officer. She was struck off the imperial register and had to retire to the country, while the officer was ordered to Spain, where he was severely wounded. He returned, however. His cure and the latest divorce were alike effected, and the story ended in a marriage, the date of which it would be indiscreet to reveal, in spite of the passing amusements at which we have hinted of the temporary revival of his passion for Josephine, of the memories that had melted and unnerved him for the moment. Napoleon was not convinced. He had not renounced the idea that haunted and possessed him. His advisers never ceased to urge it upon him. His reason and ambition seconded every such appeal. The future divorce was doubtless at the bottom of his journey to Italy at the close of 1807. One of the points that caused Josephine grave anxiety was the probable fate of her son in the event of a separation. Napoleon had, it was true, made Eugene viceroy of Italy in 1805. He had married him to Princess Augusta of Bavaria in 1806 and had conferred on him the title of Son of France, but these honors had never been ratified by a legislative measure, and Eugene's right to transmit the kingdom to his descendants rested only on Napoleon's verbal promise. The emperor was anxious to reassure both his wife and the reigning house of Bavaria. He also wished to make some inquiries as to a lady who might prove a suitable match for himself. He is supposed to have sometimes regretted not having married the vice queen, Princess Augusta, the most beautiful woman of the circles, as others had said before him. Would not her sister, Princess Charlotte, be the right wife to choose? Some such project was no doubt in his mind when he summoned the king and queen and the princess to Milan, but he seems to have presently reflected on the unseemliness of becoming the brother-in-law of his stepson. The young lady pleased him less than he had expected. He left her to her strange future and threw himself into a fresh project of marriage with a member of his own family. Surely Lolotte, the little girl he used to lead by the hand through the consular reception rooms and had not now seen for 5 years, must be grown up and marriageable by this time. She was Lucien's daughter by his first wife, Catherine Boyer, who Napoleon loved as a sister, though she was only the daughter of a humble innkeeper at St. Maximin du Phare and could not even sign her name when she first entered the family. No doubt Lolotte, who, escaping from the guardianship of her Aunt Elisa, had left France with her father and stepmother, had espoused their cause and taken up their quarrels. But she was barely 15. Childish memories might be reawakened. The emperor, whose family feeling was so strong that he scrupled to bestow a share in his sovereign dignities on any but a Bonaparte, that all his relations with his brothers seemed to resolve themselves into a series of pardons, and that a reconciliation with Lucien was in his eyes a matter of the highest moment, may have had dreams of grafting his posterity on a stem of his own stock and founding a purely Bonapartist dynasty. Failing this, for the young girl might prove hostile, he himself might feel scruples. The disparity of age was perhaps too great. How would it be to introduce a Bonapartist element by means of Lolotte into some other reigning house? That of Spain, for instance? The only marriageable girl of his own blood at the moment, she might prove an important card in his future game. He sent for her and placed her with his mother on probation, but Lolotte's sojourn in Paris was a brief one. She amused her father by her lively accounts of the court, and seems to have had no suspicion that her correspondence was examined. Napoleon soon decided that Lucien's daughter was impracticable and sent her back to Italy. There she secured a coronet in default of a sovereign crown. She married Prince Gabriele in 1815 and lived until 1865. The journey to Italy had borne little fruit as far as matrimonial schemes were concerned, but Fouché had again been busy spreading and encouraging rumors of an immediate divorce, nor were his machinations at all affected by the furious letters he received from his absent master. Keen and cunning as he was, he did not understand that the hour was past. The perils of Eylau and the plot that had been hatched during his absence may have affected the emperor's policy for the moment, but the impression had not been deep enough to last or to suggest the necessity of leaving a living representative of himself in Paris. The next time he quitted it for a campaign, he might have made up his mind. Could a suitable wife have been found at once, but the Russian Grand Duchess was a possibility. The future in the Bavarian scheme had proved abortive, and Austria, who had made overtures in 1805, had now no marriageable daughter to offer. The family marriage remained in reserve, but it might involve endless dangers and difficulty with the Luciens. It would be best to wait. To this course Napoleon not unwillingly resigned himself. During the 3 months after his return to Paris, his heart was fully occupied with Madame Walewska, who had recently arrived from Poland. His mind was busy with innumerable affairs of state, notably those of Spain, which he was anxious to settle before resuming the negotiations of Tilsit with Alexander. The question of the divorce only recurred to him at intervals when it caused him the most violent agitation. He felt less capable than ever of coming to a decision, though Talleyrand had now thrown his weight into the scale and was urging him to proceed. His nervous excitement brought on terrible internal spasms. There were times when he would draw down his wife upon his bed as she stood beside him dressed for some court function, and weeping over her, declare with sobs and cries that he could not give her up. It seemed indeed as if she had bewitched him and held him in bondage by means of some talisman, though he sometimes complained that she had grown old and lost her beauty throughout their stay at Marat's, he treated her with all the tender playfulness of a youthful lover. Who would have suspected any anxiety for the future or any projects of final rupture in the midst of such schoolboy pranks as those that enlivened their walks on the beach, when in the presence of the mounted escort he chased Josephine along the shore and pushed her into the water with peals of laughter, or when, snatching up the shoes she dropped in her haste, he threw them away and made her get into the carriage without them, that he might the better see and feel the feat he so greatly admired. At other times he was touched rather by her moral than her physical graces. Josephine had never shown a finer tact, a more delicate insight than in this journey to Bayonne. Never had she been of greater service to him, and never had she displayed her social talents to better advantage. She seemed in her element in the strange meeting with the Spanish sovereign, showing an instinctive skill, intelligence, and good breeding under difficult conditions. Then, as throughout their triumphal progress through the southern and western provinces, the heat was so intense that they were obliged to travel by night to enjoy a little fresh air. Each halt was a signal for a fresh fete, exactly like the last, and no less tedious, and for receptions and presentations without end, which oppressed him more and more with the satiety of ovation. She, however, was always in her place, a gracious smile on her lips, in spite of headaches and discomforts, always punctual and exact, always ready with the right word, the appropriate gesture. Unsurpassed in the art of unfastening jewels, she had been careful to deck herself with for the occasion, and presenting them to the matrons or young girls she had been told to distinguish with a grace that transformed a prosaic official recognition into a friendly personal gift. She charmed all who approached her by the interest she seemed to take in them and their affairs, and delighted all the mothers by her sympathetic questions about their children and households. He could not but recognize in her the complement of himself, a creature born to temper his dominant might by her caressing softness, to win the heart while he inflamed the imagination.